The message came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. My daughter's name lighting up my phone screen while I sat on my porch, listening to the rain start up on the tin roof. "I've booked a flight, Dad. I land Thursday. We need to talk about this in person. Not a question. Not, are you free Thursday?" A statement, the way you'd announce a decision that had already been made somewhere far away from the person it was actually about. I want you to sit with that message for a second before I tell you what happened 3 days later, because I think the distance between those two moments is the whole story here. 3 days after that text, my daughter Ellen was sitting across from me at a small plastic table under a tin roof, a plate of adobo going cold in front of her that she hadn't touched, watching a 9-year-old girl who wasn't her niece climb into my lap uninvited and start arguing with me, in decent English, about whether the mango tree in my yard was actually hers now that she'd claimed it. Ellen wasn't saying much. She was just watching. The particular, careful watching of a woman who'd flown 14 hours with a specific plan in her head and was now, quietly, watching that plan come apart in real time. My name is Harold. Everyone who matters to me calls me Hal. I'm 73 years old, and for 38 years I worked as an electrician, most of that time running my own small contracting business outside Portland, Oregon. I married a woman named Diane in 1974, and we had 39 good years together before cancer took her, slow and then sudden, the way it usually does, 3 years before the events I'm about to tell you about. I want to be honest that Ellen didn't fly out here on a whim. She's not an impulsive person. She's a nurse practitioner, methodical, the kind of person who color codes her calendar, and when she decided she was flying to the Philippines to bring her father home, she'd clearly spent weeks building the case in her head before she ever booked that ticket. If you're watching this tonight with your own version of that text message, a child or a parent who's decided something about your life without quite asking you first, I want you to stay with me, because what actually happened when Ellen landed wasn't the confrontation either of us expected. If this is resonating with you already, go ahead and hit like right now. It genuinely helps this story reach someone who might need to hear it tonight. And if you want to know exactly what changed her mind, subscribe, because I promise you, it wasn't anything I said to her. I had no idea, reading that text at 11:47 that Tuesday night, that within a week my daughter would be the one asking me if she could come back and visit again soon. Diane and I raised 2 kids in that same house outside Portland, Ellen and her younger brother Peter. We weren't wealthy, but the business did well enough over the years. Steady work, a paid-off house, enough set aside that retirement never felt like something to dread the way it does for some people. Diane's diagnosis came when I was 68, and the 18 months that followed were the hardest of my life, watching a woman I'd loved for 4 decades disappear in careful, cruel stages. When she finally passed, the house went quiet in a way that still catches me off guard sometimes, even now, thinking back on it. I want to be fair to my kids here, because it would be easy to make this into a story about children who didn't understand their father, and that isn't quite the truth. Ellen called every week without fail. Peter drove up from Seattle more often than his own busy life probably allowed for. They loved me, genuinely, and I never once doubted that. But something in the shape of that love started changing, gradually, in ways I didn't fully name to myself until much later. The calls that used to start with, "How are you doing?" Dad starting with, "Have you been taking your blood pressure medication, and are you eating something besides sandwiches?" Ellen, being the nurse in the family, took this particular role especially seriously. There was a specific Sunday, maybe 8 months after Diane died, when Ellen mentioned, almost as an aside while we were talking about something else entirely, that she and Peter had been looking at some assisted living communities near her, just so we have options. "Dad," she said, "exactly like that, just so we have options." I didn't say much in response, but I sat with that phone call for a long time afterward, understanding all at once that my 2 children had already been discussing this without me, probably more than once, and that whatever they eventually decided, they'd likely decide it the way you decide something for a person who's stopped being fully capable of deciding for himself. I want to tell you honestly why the Philippines specifically, because it wasn't a random dart thrown at a map. Diane and I had hosted a foreign exchange student for a single school year back in 1989. A quiet, hard-working young man named Ferdinand from a small town outside Cebu. He'd lived with us for 10 months, become something close to a third child in that house, and we'd stayed loosely in touch over the following decades. Christmas cards mostly, the occasional email as the years went on. About a year after Diane died, sitting up late one night doing exactly the kind of restless internet searching that leads nowhere good, I found Ferdinand's old emails and, on impulse, wrote to him properly for the first time in years. He wrote back within a day, warm and immediate in a way that surprised me, and somewhere in that exchange, he mentioned, almost casually, that if I ever wanted a change of scenery, his family would be glad to have me visit any time. That single sentence sat with me for months before I ever acted on it. But it was there, quietly, underneath everything, when Ellen mentioned assisted living options that Sunday, and it was there, considerably louder, the following spring when I finally booked a one-way ticket to Cebu, telling my children only after the flight was already confirmed. Ferdinand met me at the Cebu airport himself, older now, graying at the temples, but with the same steady warmth I remembered from a young man sitting at our dinner table 30 years earlier. He'd arranged a small apartment for me in a quieter town about an hour outside the city, close enough that he could visit regularly, far enough that I'd have my own space to figure out what this new life was actually supposed to look like. I want to be honest that the first few weeks were considerably harder than I'd let myself expect. The heat hit me the moment I stepped off that plane, thick and immediate, in a way 38 years of Oregon winters had done nothing to prepare me for. Everyone spoke English, so there was no language barrier to blame my loneliness on, which somehow made it stranger rather than easier. I could talk to anyone on that street, and for the first several weeks, I genuinely had nothing to say that anyone needed to hear. By day 11, I had a return flight page open on my laptop, sitting on the edge of a bed that still didn't feel like mine, in an apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a home. What actually stopped me wasn't courage exactly. It was the honest, unglamorous fact that I didn't have anything better waiting for me back in Portland. Just a quieter version of the same loneliness, with central heating instead of a ceiling fan. I closed the laptop. I didn't book the flight. But I came about as close as a man can come without actually doing it. The turning point happened about 3 weeks later, during a typhoon that knocked out power across the whole barangay for nearly 2 days. My apartment building's water pump failed on the second night, and I found myself standing in my dark kitchen at 7 in the morning, genuinely unsure how a 71-year-old man alone in a foreign country was supposed to solve a problem like that. I hadn't called anyone. I didn't fully know who to call. But by the time I'd finished that thought, there were already voices in my building's courtyard. A neighbor named Manny, who I'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with since arriving, had already found someone with the right tools and was halfway through fixing the pump himself, refusing when I tried to thank him properly, telling me simply, "You're part of the building now, sir." This is normal. That evening, an older woman from the ground floor, whose name I'd only just learned was Aring, sent up a plate of warm food with her grandson, unprompted, unasked, simply because, as Manny explained it to me later, that's what you did when the power went out and someone was managing alone. If you're sitting with your own version of that exact isolation tonight, surrounded by people yet somehow still fundamentally alone, I want you to know that Turning Point often looks smaller than you'd expect. Not a grand gesture, just someone showing up with tools or a warm plate of food without being asked. Comment below and tell me what your own version of that typhoon moment might look like, because I read every single comment, and I think there's real value in recognizing it when it actually happens. I sat in my dimly lit kitchen that night, water pump working again, plate of food finished, and felt something shift in me that I hadn't fully realized had been sealed shut. 71 years of being the one who showed up with the ladder, and it had never once occurred to me that letting someone else hold it wasn't a defeat. In the months that followed that typhoon, I built something here that I genuinely hadn't expected to find at 71 years old, a life with its own quiet, specific texture that no phone call home could ever fully convey. Manny, it turned out, ran a small motorcycle repair shop 2 streets over, and he'd taken to stopping by most evenings on his way home, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour, depending on what either of us had going on that day. He never announced these visits in advance. He simply showed up, the way you'd check on family, and somewhere along the way, I stopped finding that presumptuous and started genuinely looking forward to it. Oring, the woman who'd sent up that plate of food during the typhoon, ran a small carinderia 3 blocks from my apartment, and I became something close to a regular there within my first 2 months, ordering whatever she pointed to when I clearly didn't understand the day's menu, written in a mix of English and Cebuano I was still slowly learning. By the 3rd month, she'd started setting aside the specific cuts of fish she'd noticed I preferred, without me ever having said a word about my preferences directly. There was a young girl, Oring's granddaughter, named Marites, maybe 8 years old, who'd taken an inexplicable liking to me sometime around my 2nd month here, appearing at my table most afternoons to argue with me about cartoons I'd never heard of, or to correct my consistently terrible pronunciation of local words with the absolute confidence only children seem to possess. I learned to navigate the local market on Tuesday and Saturday mornings, learned which vendors gave you honest prices and which ones tested new foreigners with a slightly inflated one, learned enough Cebuano to order food and greet neighbors properly, though I never did master the tones the way Marites insisted I eventually would. I want to be honest about something important here, because I think it matters more than any single warm moment could on its own. This wasn't Ellen. It wasn't Peter. Manny wasn't my son, and Oring wasn't Diane. I never once confused this new, gentler kind of daily connection with what I'd actually lost. What it was, I came to understand slowly, was something genuinely its own, a kind of daily, unhurried attentiveness I hadn't experienced consistently in longer than I cared to admit, not because my own children loved me any less, but because distance, and their own full, complicated lives, had gradually, unintentionally, stopped allowing for that particular kind of presence. By my first anniversary here, I had a routine that felt genuinely mine for the first time since Diane had died. Market mornings, evening visits from Manny, Marites' relentless cartoon commentary, Oring's carinderia becoming something close to a second kitchen. None of it was extraordinary in any objective sense. All of it, taken together, quietly became the thing I hadn't fully realized I'd been missing until it was finally, unexpectedly, given back to me. Ellen landed on a Thursday afternoon, exactly as promised, and I met her at the small regional airport with a mixture of nervousness and stubborn resolve I hadn't fully anticipated feeling. She hugged me tightly at the arrivals gate, genuinely relieved to see me in person, but I could feel the careful assessment happening underneath that hug, the particular scrutiny of a nurse practitioner checking her father for signs of decline she'd half expected to find. "You look thinner," she said within the first 10 minutes. Not quite an accusation, but close to one. I told her I'd actually been eating better than I had in Portland, more fresh food, considerably less of the frozen dinners I'd relied on those first lonely months after Diane died. She didn't argue, but I could see her filing the observation away regardless. That first evening, sitting in my small apartment, Ellen laid out her case with the same methodical clarity she probably used with her patients' families, gently but firmly explaining her concerns. I was too far from immediate medical care if something happened. I was isolated from family who could actually check on me daily. I was, in her words, essentially alone in a country where none of us could reach you quickly if something went wrong. I listened without interrupting, because I genuinely wanted to understand her fear rather than simply defend against it. When she finished, I asked her a single question. "Ellen, when's the last time you actually visited me in Portland for more than a weekend?" She started to answer, then stopped herself, clearly working through the honest math of her own increasingly busy schedule back home. "That's not the point, Dad," she finally said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. I told her I understood her point completely, that her fear came from a genuine place of love, but that I wanted her to actually see my life here before deciding what it did or didn't provide me, rather than deciding it purely from a hospital break room 3,000 miles away. She agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to stay for 5 days instead of the 2 she'd originally planned. An internal flight change she made with visible frustration at her own schedule, though I noticed she made it without much further argument. The next morning, I took her to Oring's Carinderia for breakfast, and I watched my daughter's careful, clinical composure meet a 9-year-old girl who climbed uninvited into a stranger's lap and immediately began arguing about mango tree ownership rights. Ellen sat there, plate of adobo cooling in front of her, watching this entire scene with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years, something between confusion and the very beginning of genuine curiosity. Over the following days, I made a deliberate decision not to argue my case directly. I simply let Ellen walk the same streets I walked, watch the same ordinary rhythms play out in front of her, the way I'd learned they had to be witnessed rather than described to actually mean anything. On her second evening, Manny stopped by unannounced the way he always did, and instead of the polite, distant handshake I half expected, he spent nearly 40 minutes explaining local motorcycle racing to Ellen, who has never once expressed any interest in motorcycles in her entire life, while she nodded along, visibly working to reconcile this warm, unhurried stranger with the isolated, vulnerable father she'd flown 14 hours to rescue. By her third day, I noticed her taking mental notes in the particular clinical way she does, the way I imagine she assesses a new patient's home situation before discharge. She asked Oring, directly and without much diplomacy, how often she actually checked on me. Oring seemed genuinely confused by the question, eventually answering that she saw me nearly every single day, simply because that's when I came for meals, not because anyone had assigned her that responsibility. I gave Ellen the honest numbers on her 4th evening, sitting together on my small balcony, because I wanted her working from actual facts, rather than assumptions built entirely on distance and worry. My rent ran $310 a month for a clean 2-bedroom apartment, considerably more than the Toledo comparisons I'd read about, since my particular town skewed slightly more expensive, but still a fraction of my old Portland mortgage and taxes combined. Food, mostly at Oring's Carinderia, plus my own grocery shopping, ran close to $140 a month. Electricity, particularly with air conditioning running through the hottest months, could climb to $75 in April and May specifically, a cost I didn't try to minimize or hide from her. I told her honestly about the harder parts too, because I'd promised myself I wouldn't sell her a fantasy. The power went out regularly during typhoon season. Paperwork for my long-term visa had taken 3 separate trips to an immigration office and considerably more patience than I'd anticipated needing. There were evenings, even now, when the distance from her and Peter and my grandchildren caught up with me all at once, and I sat on that balcony feeling genuinely far from everything familiar. "But Dad," Ellen said quietly, after I'd finished laying it all out, "you have people checking on you here more consistently than we ever managed from 3 states away." I told her that was exactly the realization that had taken me the better part of a year to fully accept myself. That proximity and genuine daily presence weren't actually the same thing, however much they'd always felt like they should be. Part 7. Reflective Closing, plus Final CTA. Ellen's flight home was scheduled for the following morning, and on her last evening, we sat together on that same balcony, where she'd finally heard the honest numbers, watching the street below settle into its familiar evening rhythm. Motorcycles passing, a distant radio playing something in Cebuano, Oring's Carinderia visible in the distance, still serving a few late diners. "I came here with a whole plan, Dad," Ellen admitted, turning her glass slowly in her hands. "I had it all worked out on the flight over, how I'd convince you, what facility I'd already looked into, how I'd frame it so you wouldn't feel like we were taking anything away from you." She paused. "But I didn't need any of it, not one word." I told her I understood exactly why she'd built that plan, that her fear had never once felt malicious to me, only rooted in a love that didn't quite know what else to do with itself after her mother died. "I think I assumed being close meant being safe," she said quietly. I never really considered that the version of you living here, with Manny checking in every evening and Oring watching what you eat more closely than I ever managed to from 3 states away, might actually be safer than the version of you alone in that Portland house. Before she left the following morning, Ellen stopped by Oring's Carinderia one final time, and I watched her attempt, badly but genuinely, to order in the handful of Cebuano phrases Marites had spent the better part of a week teaching her, both of them laughing at her mangled pronunciation, in exactly the way Manny still laughed at mine. At the airport, she hugged me considerably longer than she had upon arrival. "I want to come back," she said, "not to check on you this time, just to visit." I told her that would mean more to me than she probably realized. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think a story like this loses its value the moment it sounds too neatly resolved. The distance between us hasn't disappeared entirely. There are still evenings when I miss my grandchildren's ordinary Tuesdays more than I let on during our calls. Still moments when this particular kind of belonging, real as it genuinely is, reminds me it isn't quite the same as being physically present for the family I raised. What I've come to understand, nearly 2 years into this life now, is that Ellen and I had both been operating under a false assumption that first difficult week, that proximity and genuine care were simply the same thing, when the actual truth turned out to be considerably more complicated than either of us initially wanted to admit. If tonight's story meant something to you, whether someone in your own life is currently trying to make a decision about your future without quite asking you first, or you're the one doing the deciding for someone else, please hit like before you go. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach the people who might actually need to hear it. And if you want to keep following exactly where this particular life continues from here, subscribe, because there's considerably more of it I haven't told you about yet. I'd love to know in the comments what your own version of that airport confrontation looks like, whatever shape it's currently taking in your own family, because I read every single one, and I think naming it honestly, the way Ellen and I finally did on that balcony, is genuinely where things start to change. My daughter flew in to drag me home. Then she saw my life. And somewhere in that difference between what she'd imagined and what she actually found, we both learned something neither of us expected to.